101 reasons to honor Black History Month. As we heard in our reading, part of the systemic violence of slavery was the separation of people, not just from their African heritage, but even here in America. The intentional separation of families and erasure of lineages is unimaginably cruel. We also celebrate Black History Month because it is also our history. There is no American history without Black history. There is no thriving early American economy without the uncompensated labor of enslaved Black people. There is no coherent American musical tradition or food tradition or language development without the influence of African Americans. It's a moment to pause and draw closer to a more complete picture of who we are as a country. This week in particular, we celebrate Black history as a form of resistance. Celebrating the history of marginalized people, refusing to forget the past is a powerful form of resisting the narrative of white supremacy and patriarchy. When they want to bring things back to the good old days, Black History Month begs the question, good for whom? I used to think of history as a sort of stuffy and inherently conservative mode of study, but this week I'm rethinking that dismissal. Researching, recovering, honoring what has gone before is essential to choosing the best course of action for today and for our future. Some of you may have heard that I had the unusual privilege of attending a historically Black high school, Booker T. Washington High School in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Deep in Jim Crow segregation, the school was founded in 1913 to serve Tulsa's Black community in the north side of town. It started with a class of 14 students and 2 teachers. The original school building was at the corner of Elgin Avenue and Easton Street in the Greenwood district. In 1920, that 4-room high school was replaced by a 3-story brick building. How did Reverend Kent end up attending a Black high school, you might be asking? Well, during the 1970-1971 school year, a small number of progressive white students voluntarily transferred to Booker T. Washington High School in a special program. Much of that effort was facilitated by All Souls Unitarian Church. The program was successful as a proof that voluntary desegregation would work. Washington High School. In 1973, Booker T was chosen to be the vehicle for Tulsa's school desegregation program. If you're paying attention, that's way after Brown versus the Board of Education, way after. Part of the desegregation busing policy was to shift Booker T into a magnet school. Students had to apply for admission. A racial quota system was established so that 45% of students admitted were Black, 45% identified as white, while the final 10% came from other ethnic categories. It was a very Black and white city in those days. Today, the school maintains exceptional academic, athletic, and arts programs. And since the Supreme Court forbid racial quotas for admissions, the school reverted to a geographical quota admission system. Given the city's lingering segregation, using geography as a basis almost completely guarantees the possibility of maintaining that racial quota system. Going there was a source of pride for all of us across racial lines. One of the things that drew us together was the antagonism and erasure by our wider city. You see, anyone who was affiliated with the school refers to it as Booker T. The wider community, however, just called it Washington. Washington High School. That microaggression of whitewashing the name attempts to erase decades of history, resistance, and excellence. Just this week, I noticed a news story about local athletes playing in the Super Bowl. The article was from a local news media who absolutely knew better. Still, they referred to the school as Washington High School. It's a complete erasure of the school, the importance of the Black history figure of Booker T. Washington, and the importance of professional sports as a launching pad for the Black community. I didn't go to Washington High School. From the lowriders in the parking lot to the gospel choir, from the step team to the funkiest high school marching band you have ever heard, it was very clear that we went to Booker T. Washington High School. I had a vague sense of the importance of my school's history and role in the community. And I had always been proud of the school's record of achievement in academics and athletics and really everything else. But here is the confession part of this sermon. The truth is, when a classmate posted on Facebook that our school was featured in the National Museum of African American History and Culture, I lit up like a Christmas tree. You see, I had seen in the passion of my Black classmates how important it was. Driving to the other side of town, the sense of pride in the school was palpable. But it took the Smithsonian, one of the widest institutions in the United States, to convince me of the school's importance. I cannot escape the internalized white supremacy that leads me to more acutely hear the reports of the Smithsonian than to respect the clear lived experience of my classmates. The school is featured in the museum for a particular historical moment. As I mentioned earlier, the original school was located in the Greenwood neighborhood. That might ring a bell. The Greenwood district is where the Tulsa Race Massacre took place. It was a 2-day-long white supremacist massacre. Mobs of white residents, some of whom had been deputized by the city government, attacked Black residents and destroyed homes and businesses. Eyewitnesses describe privately owned airplanes carrying white assailants who fired rifles and dropped firebombs on buildings and homes as families fled. It's considered one of the worst incidents of racial violence in American history. Attackers burned and destroyed 35 square blocks of neighborhood, impacting roughly 10,000 people. At the time, when Tulsa was in the midst of an oil boom, this was one of the wealthiest Black communities in the United States, which is probably where a lot of that antagonism came from. It's often called Black Wall Street. Booker T. Washington High School escaped the destruction. The building did. And immediately after the massacre, the American Red Cross used the building as its headquarters for critically important relief efforts. About 2,000 people were temporarily sheltered there. The school is a symbol of survival and excellence. Honoring that history is a small but powerful act of resistance. For me, that chunk of history from my hometown was gift-wrapped and set into my lap. I also know that each of you comes from your own hometown. Each of our personal histories is entwined with Black history and other marginalized groups. Maybe you can amplify some of those stories by learning them and retelling them, your own stories. There is no corner of these United States that is not infused with the influence or built on the backs of BIPOC people. The history of racial diversity is there. It's just a matter of connecting with it. I want to take the remaining time that we have today to celebrate some of the African American leaders in our UU tradition. And I also want to name that we are running a little long on time, but the potluck doesn't start until I'm finished. But seriously, if you need to sneak out during the hymn, that's okay. Those of you who have been around for a while are familiar with the name Bill Sinkford. I think we have a picture. Yes. The Reverend Bill Sinkford served as the president of the Unitarian Universalist Association from 2001 to 2009. That made Sinkford the first African American to lead not just our UU tradition, but the first African American to lead any traditionally white denomination in the United States. This honor is also a tremendous burden. Shortly after Sinkford's term, the position of president was reduced in length, in part because the work is understood to be so grueling. On top of the work itself, being the first and only person of your identity in a position of authority amplifies the scrutiny exponentially. You're seen as a representative of your community. Your success and failures are judged through a twisted lens of hope, internalized racism, jealousy, and so much more. Admittedly, I didn't see all that at the time, but today I thank him for not only being a great leader, but also carrying the burden of uniqueness. Sinkford grew up in Cincinnati, where he became a Unitarian Universalist at the age of 14. He wrote, "I claimed the church when, as a young Black man, I walked into First Unitarian Cincinnati and found a religious community where I could be fully myself." I imagine many of us first claimed Unitarian Universalism when we found a place where we could be fully welcomed as ourselves. However, in the 1970s, he left for a while. During the late 60s and the early 70s was a difficult period for our Unitarian Universalist racial justice journey. It's often referred to as the empowerment controversy. Obviously, there was a wide national crisis of race relations, and as we explored the issue within Unitarian Universalism, the voices of our African American members and leaders were marginalized. There was also a layer of financial crisis. The General Assembly, that's our national gathering, voted to award the fledgling Black UU organization $1 million. And then the UUA drastically reduced the amount that was promised and paid it out over a series of years. In a series of blunders, a significant number of dedicated Black Unitarian Universalists left our faith tradition. It took 10 years for the UUA to begin to even talk frankly about what had happened and how we are called to do better. Fortunately, Bill Sinkford returned after taking a break, as he was seeking a religious home for his 2 children. Between 1970 and 80, he held management positions in marketing for major companies and founded his own business. In the mid-90s, he was ordained as a Unitarian minister, and just 6 years later was elected the president of our Unitarian Universalist Association. The primary goal of his presidency was to reclaim what he referred to as the language of reverence. In those days, we were in a deep swing toward our humanist roots. Bill Singford called us to bring back some of our religious language. Since 2010, the Reverend Bill Singford has served as the senior minister of one of our most prominent churches, the First Unitarian Church of Portland, Oregon. The second person that I want to mention is a contemporary of Bill Singford's, the Reverend Mark Morrison Reed. When you talk about Unitarian Black history, he is the name that comes to mind. In addition to being a congregational minister, Reed has documented the history of African Americans in our tradition. I want you to listen closely to the titles of his books. Black Pioneers in a White Denomination. Darkening the Doorways, Black Trailblazers and Missed Opportunities in Unitarian Universalism. The Selma Awakening, How the Civil Rights Movement Tested and Changed Unitarian Universalism. And Revisiting the Empowerment Controversy, Black Power and Unitarian Universalism. Reverend Reed's family came to the tradition when he was a child. In Chicago, his dad's colleague invited the family to go with them to First Unitarian Society of Chicago, which was actively trying to become more integrated at the time. Perfect timing. In 1953, the 3 Reed children became the first African American children christened there since the congregation's founding in 1836. Family life revolved around the church. His parents were leaders, and he participated every Sunday in Sunday school. By high school, he was working as an assistant janitor in the church and for the office. He was elected president of his youth group. Ministry was a very, very natural next step in life. In '74, he began seminary. That's where his writing took off and his curiosity. He needed to know more about his African American ministerial predecessors, so he researched them for years to create his first book. The Reverend Mark Morrison Reed says that our calling as Unitarian Universalists isn't so much toward racial diversity. Our calling is toward opening of the spirit, opening to religious experience that is frightening to most of us UUs. He said, quote, "If God gets his hands on us, or if Guadalupe gets her hands on us, we might do something crazy. We're scared to death of that, and dying to have that experience at the same time." What a keen observation. In his words, healing racism cannot emerge without freedom. Stasis and control are fear's bastion. Welcoming change means being open and adventuresome. It asks us to celebrate the breadth of theology and social diversity Unitarian Universalism already encompasses, and then reach beyond it. It means recapturing the excitement we once felt about the new, the wonderment, the curiosity, the openness we knew as children before fear shut it down. It means seeing diversity as a gift we cannot wait to get in our hands. So may it be. Today, the person probably most directly shaping Unitarian Universalist conversations about race is Paula Cole Jones. She's a lay leader with decades of experience within our faith tradition and beyond. She's the co-leader of the Eighth Principle Project and an active member of the Article 2 Commission. That means she was part of ushering in the Eighth Principle and part of the team that switched us over from 8 principles to 7 values. Professionally, she's an independent consultant specializing in multicultural competencies. I could go on and on about her professional credentials, but what I was struck by this week is the loving root of her change work. She wrote a cover story for the UU World magazine. It was titled, "Reconciliation as a Spiritual Discipline." She writes, "Practicing reconciliation is my spiritual discipline. As a management consultant, I know a lot about helping people work through their differences. But until I embraced reconciliation as a spiritual practice, I didn't realize just how transformative reconciliation can be. Practicing reconciliation means I commit to being in right relationship with people in my life, and when I'm not, caring enough to face unresolved issues and improve the relationship." She continues, "I've learned to practice reconciliation in my personal relationship. It gave me the clarity to address issues with my sister." I think I can imagine that. "But I've also been learning to practice reconciliation across divides in our broken culture, especially racial divides. I've carried reconciliation with me while working in All Souls Church in Washington, where I'm a lifelong member, and increasingly in the Unitarian Universalist Association at large. I've learned that reconciliation is a competency that we can bring to all our levels of conflict in life." As I learned more about a few of our leaders this week, I heard this resounding call toward freedom and reconciliation and depth, openness, movement, change, and healing. What is set before us is not retribution. Revenge is not on the table. Instead, we are called together toward a better future. And one of the ways we do that is honoring the fullness of our past and the fullness of our theologically and racially diverse faith community. I didn't have nearly enough time today to talk about some of the other really important people. I'm going to give you a very quick summary and some names to look out for. If you hear them speaking, doing a workshop, on a podcast, whatever, listen, because it will be worth your time. Issei Barnwell was the singer-composer that we heard from our special music today. We heard her song Breaths earlier today. It was originally composed for her a cappella ensemble, Sweet Honey in the Rock. She's a longtime member of All Souls Church in Washington, D.C. Wherever you stream your music, on iTunes or Spotify or whatever, take a listen to Sweet Honey in the Rock when you get a chance. You will not be disappointed. Next is the Reverend Sophia Betancourt. She's the 10th and current president of the Unitarian Universalist Association. She was elected in June of 2023. Reverend Dr. Sophia Betancourt's 20-year ministry has included serving as a parish minister, a seminary professor, scholar of environmental ethics, and a public theologian. Watch out for her name. The youngest person on our list wrote the reading that we heard earlier today, Dr. Glenn Thomas Rideout. He's the director of worship arts ministries for First Universalist Church in Minneapolis and teaches worship and liturgy design at Meadville Lombard Theological School. He is one of our tradition's most active artists, liturgical thinkers, teachers, and worship leaders. If you've had the chance, it is a joy to sing with his leadership. Finally, I want to mention BLUE. That's an acronym for Black Lives of Unitarian Universalism. BLUE is home to hundreds of Black Unitarian Universalists and Black people who don't necessarily claim Unitarian Universalism, but claim our values. BLUE was founded in 2015, fairly recently, at a movement for Black Lives convening in Cleveland, Ohio. It was about a dozen people of Black UUs in attendance. Imagine this cohesive, national, vibrant community of Black Unitarian Universalists. And in just a few years, BLUE grew into an impactful 501c3 organization that creates life-giving, life-saving opportunities for spiritual community and Black-centered organizing. The Reverend Michael Slack, another name to listen for, is serving as BLUE's paid ministerial staff. So this is a very unusual sermon today. I hope it gives you some insight into the legacy and the current amazing work that Black Unitarian Universalist leaders are doing. We are grateful as we recognize that our commingled histories are changing every day into our shared future. The work of reconciliation, equity, freedom, spiritual growth is ours to share together. Amen.